We begin with another grim chapter in Spain's coronavirus crisis. Over 10,000 people have now died from complications linked to COVID-19. That's after a daily record 950 people passed away in the last 24 hours. Spain is now second only to Italy in the number of virus fatalities. The pandemic is also hitting the country's economy hard. Nearly 1 million people have lost their jobs since mid-March. Meanwhile, the country's healthcare workers are overwhelmed and lacking critical protective gear.
Stretched to breaking point. The wards are full at this hospital in Alicante, so coronavirus patients lie in the corridors. Just north of Barcelona, medics have turned the hospital library into an intensive care unit. Spain is one of the worst hit countries. The number of coronavirus deaths has now jumped to more than 10,000 after a record 950 deaths in the space of a day. The health workers on the front line say they are being put in an unthinkable position. We are lacking the staff at the moment, and the few staff that we have available are in a dangerous situation themselves and at risk of becoming transmitters. I got infected because of the lack of protective measures, as we don't have enough resources. There are fewer and fewer suitable protective masks. Somebody is doing things really badly, and we need them to rectify this, because if they don't do so, tomorrow we will double the number of infected health workers. If we continue like this, there won't be enough professionals to take care of our patients. But there are glimmers of hope. The rate of new infections in Spain appears to be slowing, and people are recovering. Here at a hospital in the northeast of the country, doctors discharged a 93-year-old man who has made a full recovery after 5 days in isolation. Spain has been in a nationwide lockdown since the middle of March, and the standstill is hitting the economy hard. 900,000 people have lost their jobs, and Spain's recorded its highest ever monthly rise in unemployment. The government says it will have to work on relaunching the economy once the epidemic is under control. Health officials say data shows the curve is stabilising, but despite the slowdown in the rate of infections, the fight to contain the virus is far from over.
Well, let's bring in DW correspondent Jan-Philipp Scholz in Spain. And despite the nationwide lockdown, the number of deaths has reached a new high. Is there anything else that can be done here? Are there any other further measures under discussion to help save lives?
Well, the measures here in Spain were just tightened some days ago, and together with Italy, they are by far the strictest in Europe now. Only employees of the so-called essential sectors can go to work, and even small walks are prohibited now. So Spaniards ask themselves, how much stricter can the measures be? And also the government announced today that it would start using mobile phone data to track people's movements. The officials stress that it's 100% anonymous and that it will be only used to analyze the measures and not for law enforcement purposes. But of course, some Spaniards are skeptic about it.
Just in terms of the profile, demographic of the sick and the dead, which population groups are being worst hit by the crisis in Spain?
Well, it's the elderly people who have been hit the hardest by far, which is especially tragic, of course, because they're also the most vulnerable group. The news from nursing homes all over the country is very disturbing. The mayor of Barcelona said today that up to 70% of the nursing homes in the city might be affected by the coronavirus. But of course, we also have to be careful with those official statistics, because the testing capacities are very limited, and there might also be a lot of younger people infected, but with mild symptoms and not tested.
Turning to the economics, 900,000 people have already lost their jobs. What help can they expect?
Well, that's a good question. It's true that the month of March has been the worst in the history of the Spanish economy, and the the government has been rolling out new measures almost on a daily basis. For the people that are worst affected by the crisis, there are some immediate measures in place now. Among them are the stop of evictions, direct financial aid, and also easy, accessible loans. But almost all experts agree that this is not enough, and the Spanish people have some very, very hard economic days and weeks and months ahead.
Jan Philipp Scholz in Spain, thank you. Well, Russian President Vladimir Putin has extended the country's coronavirus lockdown until April 30. All citizens, with the exception of essential workers, are to stay at home, with all salaries to be paid throughout this period. In a televised address, Putin stressed the seriousness of the threat facing the country and that the peak of the virus still lay ahead.
The non-working week, declared all over the country, as well as self-isolation regime for residents of many regions, allowed us to win some time for preventive actions, to mobilize all the authorities, to increase healthcare resources, to fight the epidemic with maximum efficiency, using both our own experience and the best practice of other countries.
We're joined now by DW correspondent Emily Sherwin in Moscow. Emily, President Putin calls this a non-working period or even a nationwide coronavirus holiday. What is behind this language?
Well, the language, of course, is rather euphemistic. Last week, Putin already announced a week-long holiday, and the Kremlin followed that announcement with an encouraging statement saying that people should actually be encouraged to keep working. Now, of course, this positive wording that Putin is using essentially allows him to be the good guy. He talked about the fact that different regions in Russia have been affected to different extents, and he called on regional governors and mayors of cities to kind of implement their own measures according to the seriousness of the situation in different regions. And that, of course, means that the regional authorities will have to essentially be the bad guys when they institute strict measures. Now, we've already seen Moscow put people in self-isolation last week, and many regions following. Moscow within Russia has been the hardest hit. There have been around 3,500 cases across the country, and 2,500 of them, around that number, are in Moscow. And this week, the city authorities have been discussing how they're going to be implementing those self-isolation measures next week, using smart technologies like facial recognition and using the geolocation data from people's mobile phones. And Moscow has been kind of a testing ground for measures, so we're likely to see strict measures in other regions as well.
And how are the people in Russia reacting to these measures that you talk about?
Well, last week when Putin announced this kind of week-long coronavirus holiday, as you called it, people kind of took him by his word. Some people booked flights to the Black Sea city of Sochi. There were images on social media of people in Moscow barbecuing, and then the authorities took rather strict measures, for example, by closing hotels in Sochi, by imposing this self-isolation in the capital. And I think people now have understood the seriousness of this and the fact that these are essentially just euphemisms. Moscow certainly is rather empty. There's hardly any traffic. There are billboards around the city calling on people to stay home. Presenters on state TV are presenting from their living rooms. Some of them are wearing masks to encourage people to kind of stay home as well. And I think people are starting to understand that here as well, and they are likely to understand it even better if strict measures come into force as well across the country.
Emily Sherwin in Moscow, thank you. In South America, Brazil has the most cases of the coronavirus and the highest death toll. Almost 7,000 people have been infected. That includes the first coronavirus case among its indigenous population. The country's president, Jair Bolsonaro, has been under fire for his handling of the pandemic. Last month, he referred to COVID-19 as, quote, a measly cold. He's also the only major world leader continuing to criticise lockdown measures designed to slow the spread. of the virus.
It was a deliberate provocation by President Jair Bolsonaro, visiting a supermarket surrounded by shoppers right in the middle of the coronavirus crisis. Bolsonaro himself may be infected with the virus. This is why he chose to mingle all the same.
Should I have the coronavirus, I, as a former athlete, don't need to worry. I wouldn't notice anything. At the most, a touch of the flu or a cold. Our families must be able to feed themselves. That's why we should now all be returning to normal.
People in Rio de Janeiro's biggest shanty town took their president at his word. After days of isolation, residents went back to work, shrugging off the dangers of the virus. The local mayor fears he may soon be dealing with an epidemic.
It'll be a disaster. We've already been fighting a tuberculosis outbreak. Now residents don't realise that they would be safer staying at home. The crisis is escalating.
Unlike Bolsonaro, Brazil's provincial governors acted from the start, shutting beaches, schools and supermarkets. Scientists are warning that the crisis is just beginning.
We estimate that the epidemic curve in Brazil will peak in 2 to 3 weeks. The infection rate is constantly increasing.
Across Brazil, coronavirus victims are being buried, and young people are among the dead. These scenes have sparked protests. Residents have been banging pans in anger at Bolsonaro. He eventually backtracked.
We have a mission to save lives without threatening jobs. We have to focus on both the virus and the economy.
In an apparent U-turn, Bolsonaro now wants to fight the virus, but too late to prevent him losing many supporters who now see him as irresponsible.
Oh, for more on this, we're joined now from Rio de Janeiro by the correspondent who filed that report, Matthias Ebert. Matthias, do we know where Bolsonaro has been getting his information from and why he brushed off warnings for so long?
As we see, there are two major wings inside his own government, and in the last weeks the predominant wing were the science deniers, religious groups who advised him to talk in the way we saw in the report. But on Tuesday this changed. The wing of the militaries and the science-friendly groups inside his government told him to lower his voice and to not anymore talk against isolation measures. So now Bolsonaro is much more moderate than before.
Regional leaders have taken the initiative to warn people on their own in some cases. Is the country's healthcare system also ready for an onslaught of infections?
The public healthcare system of Brazil is much better than in other countries here in South America. The governors of the different states in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, they are constructing special hospitals, temporary hospitals with more beds for corona cases. For example, in the famous Maracanã Stadium and also in the Sambodrome, the Carnival Temple of Rio de Janeiro. So there are measures taken, but we have to see and wait for the numbers of death and infections here in Brazil, and this would be really, not sure. We are not sure so far if it will be enough and if poor people will have access.
And quickly, what about Brazil's indigenous people, Matthias, and the threat to them?
Yeah, they are vulnerable, and they went to the Amazon forest. Many groups, tribes went back to the Amazon because they have no antibodies, and as they know from the memories that former generations suffered from diseases brought by white people. So they went back, some groups, and they want to hide deep inside the forest.
Correspondent Matthias Ebert reporting from Rio. Thank you.